Good morning, guys. Hope you're doing well, and I hope everything's going okay for you during this time of social distancing. I know if you're like me, this is getting really old. I need to get out and start seeing people again. My wife and I miss being around our friends and being with each other in other places besides our own home. Um, but it is still necessary, but the word is we'll be through this soon. So hang in there, okay? Hang in there. Keep doing the right thing. It'll be better for all of us in the end. But I do want to continue today with the issues of what caused the Civil War. What are the issues that led up to it? And I first wanted to just quickly review the two things I've already covered before because it's important to understand the background here. First, why did America take so long, almost 100 years or more, um, in addressing the issue of slavery head on? And I said the answer was in a single word: money, profits. That money that was coming in through cheap cotton. The southern plantation owners obviously wanted to keep their profits high through free labor, which they were getting through slavery. Um, the northern factory workers, especially the textile mills, they wanted to keep the profits coming through cheap cotton, and they knew that cheap cotton was coming as a consequence of the free labor, i.e., slavery in the South. And the northern factory workers, they knew that if the slaves were suddenly freed, many of them would be moving north to compete for the same jobs that they were trying to have. And so everybody had a vested personal, maybe selfish interest in keeping slavery going. Even though many of them, especially in the North, began to or were saying that slavery is evil and needs to come to an end, but there wasn't a whole lot of movement to make it come to an end. So the second thing I talked about was what is it going to take to get people beyond their own selfish needs and their own selfish interests in profits and jobs. And I said the answer to that was kind of two sides of the same coin. One side is religion, and the other side is art. The religion side had to do with the Second Great Awakening, in which there was a revival that lasted about 50 years that said that Americans needed to not only fix themselves morally and get their own hearts right with God, but they also needed to reform society. It wasn't just good enough to reform their own souls, but they needed to reform the society in which they lived in. And I said the other side of that coin was the idea of the arts, specifically in literature, with books like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and The Art of Rhetoric. The art of rhetoric is the ability and the talent of influencing people through either writing or through speeches. And the one person who exemplified that the most was the escaped slave Frederick Douglass. And so those artistic ways, along with the movement as a result of the Second Great Awakening, that began to change, especially in the North, people's hearts towards the issues of slavery or the issues that surrounded slavery, and began to make it possible and give people the courage, that's a good word, the courage within their own heart to put their own self-interests aside, their own need for profitable factories and jobs, and say there's a bigger and more important issue here, which is that the country needs to stay together, the Union, and it needs to do so while eliminating slavery, even if over a long period of time, whatever it might take. But those two things needed to happen to reform society. The Union, the United States, needed to stay together, and slavery needed to come to an end. And those came about because people began to have the courage, due to their faith and their emotional connectedness to the issues, that began to help them put the ideas of self-interest, of profits and money aside, or at least make it second place. But now we have kind of a psychological courage, awareness, and willingness to do the right thing. But what then pushes this issue of slavery to the point where it actually begins to change, or at least led to physical fighting, the actual Civil War? And that's what we want to begin talking about over the next couple of days. So today I want to talk about three things. First, had to do with land. And in fact, all of the things we're going to be talking about over the next few days, or a couple of days anyway, has to do with the issue of land. So, two parts here. Number one, we talked about manifest destiny, the fact that almost overnight, I mean, if you talk about historical terms, almost overnight, America went from a few East Coast states to a country that spanned every bit of land, 3,000 miles of land between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and another 1,500 miles of land going from Mexico to Canada. Suddenly overnight, America had all this land. The question was, will this land allow slavery or will it not? All this new land. And that becomes the debate that happens between about the year 1820 all the way up to 1861 when the Civil War begins. Will slavery spread into the new land, or will slavery be restricted to just the states that already had it? And that becomes a major conflict. Okay, now in Congress there's the Constitution. Our country's run by the Constitution. And the entire United States Constitution, remember, is all about balance. We did not want one person or one institution to control all the power. So we balanced that out and we created three different branches, and each branch had its own separate power, but it also balanced the power between the other two. That balance then also at the same time kind of becomes a major issue that leads to slavery. And you think, well, how does that happen? What happens because for example, in 1820, there was a balance of power. There were exactly 11 states in the north that banned slavery, and there were 11 states in the south that allowed slavery. And that balance meant that nobody could pass a law against slavery and nobody could pass a law for slavery. It just kind of was stuck the way it is. But now when you add that land issue, it's going to come down to a conflict. So the issue comes up really with the issue of the state of Missouri. Missouri at this time was a territory. In 1819, it was just a territory. In other words, it wasn't a state yet. It was just part of this massive amount of land that the United States controlled. And Missouri decided they wanted to become a state. Now, the way the Constitution works is that anytime there is a United States territory, in other words, land that the United States controls or owns, and that territory decides it wants to change its status from being a territory to being a full-on state, it needs to meet a couple of requirements. One is a requirement of population. There needs to be enough people living there. I don't remember the exact number. I think it's like 60,000, something like that. As long as they got a certain minimum number of population. And then the second thing is the people of that territory need to vote. And if they vote, yes, we want to become a state, then they could apply to the Congress to become a state and be added to the Union. It's still the law today. For example, the island of Puerto Rico, just down south of us in the Caribbean, in the Gulf of Mexico, Puerto Rico is a United States territory. And about every 10 years or so, they have an election and they vote. Do we want to shift from being a territory to being a state? Or do we want a complete independence and not be either one? And at least three times in the last 50 years, Puerto Rico had that vote, and it's very close. I would predict that possibly within the next 10 or 20 years, Puerto Rico may vote to become a state, and we would have 51 states. That's possible, and America has a few other territories too. So that's still a possibility. But in 1819, Missouri wanted to become a state. And so they voted and they decided we want to become a state, but we want to become a slave state. Now, again, the Constitution is all about balance. The northern states knew that if Missouri came in as a slave state, that would mean that there'd be enough votes in Congress to pass other laws supporting slavery. So the North did not want Missouri to coming in as a state, a slave state. Right? The South, of course, wanted Missouri to come in as a slave state for the very same reason. It would give them greater power in Congress. It would tip the balance in their favor. So they came up with a compromise. It's called the Compromise of 1820. in which Missouri would be allowed to come in as a slave state, but then they would take that other territory way up in the Northeast called Maine, and they would allow Maine to come in as a free state. And that kind of made both sides okay. Now we're back to a balance again. So we have the same number of slave and same number of free states. And that avoided the conflict and again kicked the can down the road. Slavery was not going to be addressed. Congress was never going to have enough support either one way or the other to change the issue. So slavery remains. So the Compromise of 1820 said that Maine would come in as a free state, Missouri would come in as a slave state, and that model for how to address this issue and avoid the issue of slavery became the model for how to address other issues in the future. Unfortunately, it didn't work because at some point, morality has to kick in and people are going to need to be forced to do the right thing. So that pushes the can, kicks the can down the road for about another 30 years. Then we talked about the gold rush and how California suddenly had this vast amount of people moving to California in 1849 because of the gold rush. Well, the number one thing that did, aside from making a few people rich, but the number one thing it did is it made San Francisco a vastly populated city and gave the territory of California enough population to become a state. So California voted and they said in 1849, we want to become a free state. And again, the argument starts all over again. The South said, no, California can't come in as a free state because if it does, then there will be more free states and slave states, and they're going to try to vote slavery out. The North, of course, wanted California to come in as a free state. So the question was, what do we do now? How do we get this balance back? And at the time, there really wasn't any more territories that were qualified to become a state yet. There might be in the future, but as of 1849, 1850, California was really the only one. And it deserved to become a part of the United States. They had the population and they had the vote, and according to the Constitution, they could become a state. So what to do? How to strike a balance? And after a lot of debating and arguing, they finally came up with what's known as the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 had about 5 different features to it, but I only want to talk about 2 because these 2 basically gave both the North and the South something that they wanted. The North got California to come in as a free state. So now there's one more free state than there was slave states. So California comes in as a free state. What did the South get out of it? They got something called the Fugitive Slave Act. One of the complaints that the southern states had was that many slaves had been escaping to the North. You may have read about or talked about or seen the movie recently, Harriet, about people like Harriet Tubman, who used the Underground Railroad to help slaves escape to the North and either make it to the free states of the North or make it up all the way into Canada, where there wasn't any slavery. And so Harriet Beecher Stowe, she talked about this in her book, but the whole point is that a lot of these people, with the support of people like Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, were helping slaves move to the North for freedom. And these newly freed slaves, like Frederick Douglass, for example, were now living as free people in the North, and the North knew exactly who they were. The northern people in Boston, Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, Chicago, those areas, they knew that these African Americans living there had been slaves before, but they'd escaped. The South wanted those slaves back. They argued those slaves, those escaped slaves, were our property. It's almost hard to refer to somebody like that, but in 1840, 1850, that was the language. It's called chattel, not cattle, don't confuse that, but the word chattel. And the word chattel simply means movable property, something that you own that you can pick up and move from one place to another is what chattel is. And so this property, the South said, needs to be returned to us. So in order for California to come in as a free state, the Southern people said, okay, fine. If California comes into the free state, we want those slaves returned. And so they passed what's called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And that required by law that all citizens must report and turn in and capture and turn into the police, turn into the authorities, any slaves, ex-slaves, or escaped slaves living in their area. That supposedly made the South happy. That was going to provide the balance that they wanted. What it actually ended up doing was creating even more anti-slavery people. Because in the North, people who had thought in their mind that slavery was an issue way down south, wasn't something they had to deal with. Somebody living in Boston who said, you know what, slavery's not my problem. That's way down there in Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee. That's a southern issue. It doesn't affect me here, way up here in Boston, right? Or Connecticut or Illinois or Ohio. Those are their issues. That's not my issue. Suddenly, the Fugitive Slave Act, by law, required you, if you're living in the North, required you to capture an escaped slave and turn them in and have that person returned to the South to go back into slavery. Could you do it? I know I couldn't. And so a lot of people who had been turning a blind eye to slavery were now, by law, forced to face the issue of slavery, forced to choose sides. Will I support the South and return these slaves to slavery, or will I support the North and join the anti-slavery movement? And that really begins to turn things around. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made everybody, by law, part of the slavery system. And people who wanted to get away from slavery, didn't want to deal with the issue of slavery, were now by law forced to deal with it. And that made people mad. Next week, or next on Tuesday, I'll be covering and giving to you guys the assignments for the next part of this. We're going to cover the next 3 issues. But for today, go on to the rest of this. There's a PowerPoint for you to open up. You're going to go through just the first 2 sections. I think it's the first, I don't want to say like 20 slides maybe. It's kind of a boring PowerPoint. There's almost no pictures in it. But the questions within the quiz, I've included a lot of pictures so you can kind of see some of the people and issues we're talking about. And the questions come almost word for word from the PowerPoint. So just read through it and just find the answers, and hopefully you'll get something out of this to see how people are being forced to face the issue of slavery, even though they may not have wanted to face it. Now they're being forced to, and we'll cover this again later. You guys take care. Get through this assignment. Hang in there. I know the challenges are difficult, but I'm confident that you guys can do it. Okay. Blessings to you all. Have a good cup of coffee. Have a great day. Bye-bye.